The high desert wind carried the scent of blood and burnt powder long before Ethan Cole saw the wagon. It was a dry, scouring wind, the kind that came down from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in late October, promising a hard winter and harder choices. He rode his buckskin gelding Dusty with the easy posture of a man who had spent more years in the saddle than he cared to count. 40 years old, and most of those years had left their marks on him like brands on leather. He was not looking for trouble. He was checking his trap lines, the Newhouse number 4 traps he had set along the arroyos and creek beds, each one costing him $2.50 at the Santa Fe Mercantile. It was honest work, solitary work, the kind that asked nothing of him but patience and the willingness to rise before dawn. But trouble, as Ethan had learned in 4 decades of living, was the primary crop of New Mexico territory. It grew wild in the spaces between towns, in the shadows of mountains, in the hearts of desperate men. The Winchester Model 1873 rested in its scabbard against his right leg, the wood warm from the sun. 24-inch barrel, 44-40 caliber, bought new in the centennial year for $60 he had saved over 2 winters. The rifle was a tool, like the traps, like the file in his saddlebag, like his own scarred hands. He trusted it the way he trusted Dusty beneath him, which was to say completely without sentiment. He found the wreck in a shallow arroyo 10 miles shy of the Santa Fe Trail, where it curved north toward the territorial capital. The wagon was a missionary rig, or had been. One wheel was splintered, the spokes jutting out like broken ribs. The canvas cover was scorched black and flapping in the wind, snapping with a sound like distant gunfire. 2 mules lay dead in their traces' throats, cut with the efficiency that spoke of men who knew their business and did not waste time. Ethan reined Dusty to a halt 20 yards out. His hand did not move to the rifle. Not yet. His eyes swept the rocks, the scattered pinon pines, the rim of the arroyo. Nothing moved. The raid was over. Hours old by the look of the blood, dried to a dark crust on the stones. The bandits had been thorough. Sacks of flour and beans were split open, their contents spilling white and brown across the ground. Whatever ammunition and whiskey the wagon had carried was gone. 2 men lay nearby, black-frocked and pale, their eyes wide, with the surprise of meeting their maker so violently. Missionaries. Ethan had seen one of them in Santa Fe once, shouting about damnation and the heathen's soul from a wooden crate on the plaza. The man's mouth was open now in a silent scream, and there was no salvation in his frozen face. Bandits, Ethan thought. Apaches would have taken the mules. He dismounted, the Winchester now in his hands, and moved forward with the careful steps of a man who had learned not to assume anything in this country. The air smelled of death and spilled grain and something else, something human and afraid. A sound cut through the wind, small, thin, metal scraping on stone. Ethan moved toward the back of the wagon, his steps quiet despite his 190 pounds and the heavy cavalry boots he wore. And there she was. The girl was chained to the rear axle. The chain was heavy, meant for livestock, 40 pounds of iron links and a cuff that had rubbed her ankle raw and bloody. She was Apache young, maybe 18 or 19 years old. She wore the ragged remnants of a calico dress, stiff with dried blood from a gash on her forehead. She was barely conscious, her black hair matted with dirt and blood, her lips cracked and white with dehydration. When Ethan's shadow fell over her, she flinched. A sound came from her chest, low and animal. Pure terror crystallized into breath. She tried to scramble backward, but the chain snapped her short, the iron cuff digging deeper into the raw flesh of her ankle. Her eyes were bottomless, taking in his worn Union coat, the beard shadowing his jaw, the rifle in his hands. Ethan stopped. He had seen fear before. He had caused it in the war when he wore the uniform and followed orders that made sense only in the logic of killing. But this fear was different. This was the fear of someone who had learned that men were predators and she was prey. He lowered the rifle slowly. He held up his hands, palms out, fingers spread. "Easy," he said. His voice was rough from disuse. He spoke perhaps 20 words a day, most of them to Dusty. "I won't hurt you." She stared at him. Her eyes never left his face. She was taking in every detail, measuring him, calculating whether this was a different kind of danger or just the same beast in a different skin. Ethan went to his saddlebag. He moved slowly, deliberately, keeping his hands visible. He pulled out his canteen and a flat bastard file 12 inches long, purchased from the Montgomery Ward catalog 2 years prior. The file had cost him $1. It was the only tool he had that might cut through chain. He held up the canteen first. He uncorked it, tilted it to his own lips, and drank. The water was warm and tasted of iron. He swallowed, showing her his throat, showing her it was safe. Then he set the canteen on the ground just within her reach and stepped back. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. She drank, spilling half of it down her chin, her body shaking with the effort of holding the canteen. When it was empty, she let it fall. Her eyes came back to him, wary, waiting. Ethan knelt by the chain. He could see where it was fixed to the axle with a heavy pin. "This will make noise," he said mostly to himself. He was not sure if she understood English. Her people spoke Apache, and he knew perhaps 10 words of that language, most of them learned from his wife before she died. He set the file to the iron link closest to her ankle. Every rasp of metal made her jump. The sound was sharp grating of violence against the silence of the dead wagon and the waiting desert. The sun beat on his back. The file grew hot in his hands. His knuckles scraped against the wagon bed until they bled. He worked steadily, sweat dripping from his beard onto the dusty ground. It took him near 20 minutes. The sun had moved a hand's width across the sky. The file grew slick with his blood and sweat. And then the link gave way with a sharp snap that echoed off the arroyo walls. The chain fell away. She did not move. She just stared at the broken link, then at him, as if she could not understand the concept of being free from it. As if freedom itself was a language she had forgotten how to speak. "Can you stand?" he asked. She said nothing. Ethan was not even sure if she understood the words. He reached for her and she recoiled, pulling her knees to her chest, making herself small. "All right," he said, sighing. "Right, I'm not them." He stood up and turned his back to her. It was a deliberate show, a gamble. If she wanted to run, she could. If she wanted to die here, that was her choice too. He walked to Dusty, rummaged in his bedroll, and came back with a strip of jerky and an old wool blanket. He set them down near her well, out of his own reach. Then he sat on a rock 20 feet away and waited. The sun crept toward the western mesas. He watched it move, watched the shadows lengthen, watched the light turn from white to gold to amber. It was a long time before she moved. First, she ate the jerky. She tore at it like a starved wolf, her teeth working the tough meat until she could swallow it. Then slowly, painfully, she pulled herself to her feet, using the broken wagon wheel for support. She was small, thin as a willow switch, but she stood straight. Her bare feet were bleeding on the stones. She looked at him. Then she looked at the vast, empty desert around them. There was nowhere to go. The nearest settlement was Santa Fe, a day's ride. The nearest water was the creek by his homestead, 3 hours north. She could run, but she would be dead by morning. Coyotes or the cold, it made no difference. Ethan stood. He did not speak. He knew she was making a calculation, weighing the devil she knew against the devil she did not. He mounted Dusty and weighted the buckskins shifting under him. He knew he should ride on. Taking her in was a fool's errand. It was borrowing a fight with every settler, every soldier, every territorial judge, and federal marshal within 200 miles. He was a man who wanted only to be left alone to nurse the wound that had never healed, to live out his days in the high country where the wind did not carry the voices of ghosts. He looked at her again, at the high cheekbones and the dark almond-shaped eyes. And he was not in the arroyo anymore. He was 5 years gone in a small cabin near Taos, watching his wife Sarah. Her hand gripped his, her face pale with sweat and pain. She had been mixed blood Comanche and Irish, a woman who understood both the prairie and the parlor. He had loved her with a force that terrified him. He had lost her in that cabin, lost her and the child she was birthing, their daughter who had taken one breath, one single breath, like a sound and then fallen silent. He had buried them together beneath the largest pinon pine on the ridge, their bodies wrapped in the wedding quilt Sarah had stitched during their first winter together. The Apache girl in the dirt had eyes that reminded him of Sarah. Not the color, but the same look of a soul caught between two worlds belonging to neither. He was not a hero. He was not a good man. Not anymore. He was just a man haunted. He could not save Sarah. He could not breathe life back into Emma's tiny lungs. But he could not ride away from this girl and her silent scream. "Come on," he said, his voice softer. She watched him for another full minute, measuring, deciding. Then with halting, painful steps, her bare feet leaving small blood prints on the stones, she walked to him. She did not take the offered hand. She just stood beside the horse, waiting. Ethan leaned down, hooked an arm around her waist and lifted her. She weighed almost nothing, all bone and sinew, and compressed fear. He settled her in front of him on the saddle, her back pressed against his chest. She was rigid, a block of ice trembling so hard he could feel it in his own bones. He wrapped the old blanket around her, tucked it tight, and turned Dusty's head toward the mountains. "You're safe," he whispered to the wind, or perhaps to himself. "It's all right." She did not make a sound the entire ride home. His land was high up, nestled in a small valley where the pinon pines gave way to aspen and spruce. It was isolated a full day's ride from Santa Fe, and that was how Ethan had wanted it when he filed the claim 6 years ago. The cabin was sturdy, built of timber he had cut and hewn himself with a stone chimney and a deep porch that faced east to catch the morning light. A small barn and a fenced corral stood nearby. There were 6 Plymouth Rock hens in a coop he had built from split rails. It was a lonely place, a place to forget the world and be forgotten in turn. The ride took 3 hours. The sun was bleeding into the western sky when they arrived. Ethan slid off Dusty and reached up for the girl. She let him take her, her body pliant now, cold and exhausted beyond resistance. He carried her inside and set her down on the single chair by the cold hearth. The cabin was one room 16 by 20 feet, a cot with a straw mattress, a table he had planed from pine logs, 2 chairs, a dry sink with a bucket of water. Shelves held tins of beans and flour, a few precious pounds of coffee, and 7 books of Bible, 2 Louis L'Amour novels he had read a dozen times each, a primer he had bought for a child who never lived to read it, and 3 technical manuals on blacksmithing and carpentry. A rifle rack locked held his Sharps 50 caliber, the Winchester, and a Colt Army Model 1860. The air was stale, smelling of old smoke and male solitude. The girl's eyes darted everywhere. She looked at the locked rifle rack, the empty cot, the way the door bolted from the inside. She was a captive animal measuring the dimensions of a new cage. "My name is Ethan," he said, striking a match and lighting the kindling in the fireplace. "Ethan Cole." She said nothing. She watched the flames catch. "I need to clean that cut," he said. He went to the sink, poured water from the bucket into a small pot, and set it on the hook over the fire to warm. He pulled a tin from a shelf. Salve made from bear fat and herbs he gathered in the high meadows each summer. It stung like the devil but kept infection at bay. When he approached her with the wet cloth, she flinched and raised her hands to protect her face. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and steady. "Just water. Just cleaning the dirt." He moved slowly. He dabbed at the blood on her forehead. The cut was shallow but dirty. She hissed when the warm water touched it, but she let him clean it. He put a dab of the salve on it. Her skin was hot. She had a fever. "You need to eat something better than jerky," he said. He made a thin gruel from cornmeal and water, adding a spoonful of molasses for strength. He held the bowl out to her. "Food," he said. "Eat." She took the bowl and ate, her eyes never leaving him. When she was done, she set the bowl on the floor. Night was falling. The wind howled outside, a high, lonely sound that matched the emptiness inside Ethan's chest. The cabin was warming up, the fire crackling and popping, but the girl was still shaking. "You can have the cot," he said, pointing to it. "It's warm. I'll take the floor." She looked at the cot, a simple frame with a straw-stuffed mattress and several thick wool blankets. She looked at him. Then she shook her head, a short, sharp negative. "It's safe," he said. "I won't. I sleep on the floor." She stood up. She walked to the door and unbolted it. She slipped outside into the freezing dark. Ethan cursed under his breath. He grabbed a blanket and followed her. She had huddled on the porch, her back against the cabin wall, her arms wrapped around her knees. Her body was already turning blue from the cold. Frost was forming on the rail. "You'll die out here," he said, frustrated. "It's going to snow before morning. Get inside." She pressed herself harder against the wall, her eyes pleading. He understood then. The room had one door. He was a man. She had been in locked rooms with men before. Those rooms had not been safe. He threw the blanket over her. "Stubborn," he muttered. He went back into leaving the door cracked open so she could see him, and sat in the chair watching the fire. He did not sleep. He heard her coughing around midnight, a wet rattling sound that spoke of lungs filling with a fluid. Just before dawn, when the frost was a thick white pelt on the ground and the stars were fading, he went out. She was asleep, but it was a bad sleep. Her breathing was shallow and her skin was icy to the touch. He scooped her up. She was too weak to fight. He carried her inside, laid her on the cot, and piled every blanket he owned on top of her. He built the fire up until it was roaring, until the cabin was hot as a forge. And he sat beside her, bathing her face with a cool cloth as the fever took hold. She was sick for 4 days. She woke in terror, shouting in a language he did not know, fighting shadows. He held her down gently, forcing water and thin broth between her lips. He did not sleep except in the chair, an hour at a time. He talked to her. The sound of his voice seemed to soothe the panic. He told her about the homestead, about Dusty, about the way the weather turned in the high country. He did not talk about Sarah. On the 5th day, the fever broke. He woke to find her watching him. Her eyes were clear, the terror replaced by a deep, bottomless caution. She was still wary of the cabin, so he found a compromise. The back porch was deep, used for storing wood and tools. He spent 3 days enclosing it. He sawed timber, nailed planks, and sealed the cracks with mud and straw. He built a small, crude fireplace of river stone and clay, venting it with a stovepipe through the roof. He moved the cot into the new room. It was small, barely big enough to stand in, but it was hers. It had its own door to the outside, and it had a latch on the inside. When he was done, he showed it to her. He pointed to the wooden latch, a simple drop bar that slid into place from within. "Yours," he said. "You lock it." She touched the wooden latch. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. That night, she slept in the little room, and he heard the sound of the latch sliding into place. The sound was a small victory. It meant she was not running. It meant she might someday trust that she could lock him out if she needed to. He began to gain her trust, not with words, but with routine. November turned the high country cold. The aspens on the ridges went bare, their white trunks stark against the dark evergreens. Snow dusted the peaks of the Sangre de Cristos. The work of survival was constant. Ethan chopped wood from dawn until his hands were raw. Each day required 40 to 50 pounds of pinon and aspen to keep both fires burning. He repaired the fences on his corral, 50 split rail posts that needed replacing before the ground froze solid. He ground his yearly supply of corn with a heavy stone matete, a tool Sarah had taught him to use, the rhythmic grinding, a meditation that kept his hands busy and his mind mercifully empty. He left a plate of food on the porch rail 3 times a day. Morning cornmeal gruel with molasses. Noon cornbread and jerky. Evening bean stew with salt pork or rabbit when he could trap one. He would knock on her door, then walk away, letting her eat in private. He left small things where she would find them. One day it was a bar of lye soap he had made himself from rendered fat and wood ash. Another day, a wooden comb he had bought in Santa Fe for 25 cents. He had seen her trying to untangle her hair with her fingers, a hopeless task. He left the comb on the woodpile. The next day it was gone. He bought a warm wool shawl in town, a deep red color that had cost him $1.50 he could ill afford. He left it folded on her chair. That evening he saw her sitting by her small fire, the shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. He gave her space. He never approached her new room without knocking. He never looked at her for too long. He treated her not as a woman or an Apache or a captive, but as a wary animal he was trying not to spook. Slowly she began to emerge. One morning he was splitting logs when he felt her presence. She was standing 20 feet away, watching. He paused, the axe in his hand. She pointed to the axe. "I try," she said. It was the first word he had heard her speak. Her voice was soft, hesitant, testing the shape of the English word in her mouth. Ethan was surprised. He nodded. He showed her how to stand, how to brace the wood, how to let the weight of the tool do the work. She was clumsy at first, the blows glancing off the log, but she was determined. She worked until she was breathing hard, her small frame straining. He did not interfere. He just watched. The next day she was there again. She picked up the smaller axe and began splitting kindling. She began to mimic all his chores. He would mend a section of fence, and she would be there holding the post steady while he tamped the earth. He would grind corn, and she would take a turn, her body moving with the steady rhythm of the stone. She was quiet, always quiet, but her intensity was unnerving. She watched his hands. She studied how he tied a knot, how he cleaned his rifle, how he banked the fire at night. She was learning him. They worked side by side for weeks, often without a single word passing between them. The silence changed. It was no longer the tense, frightened silence of her arrival. It became a shared silence, a language of mutual labor. The homestead, which had been his prison of grief, began to feel like a shared space. Early December brought the first serious cold. Ice formed on the water bucket each morning. Ethan's breath came out in white plumes as he worked. He was tanning a buckskin hide by the side of the cabin, scraping the flesh from the skin with a curved knife, when he felt the presence. He had not heard footsteps. There had been no warning. The man was simply there, standing at the edge of the pines, as if he had materialized from the trees themselves. An Apache elder, 68 years old, perhaps older. His hair was long and white, braided in two plaits that hung over his shoulders. His face was creased and weathered like old leather. He wore buckskin clothing, a hunting knife at his belt, and a small medicine bag on a thong around his neck. His eyes were black and deep and sharp. Ethan's hand moved to the Colt at his hip. Not drawing, just touching. A reflex born of 20 years in hard country. The old man spoke, his voice carrying the weight of years and the accent of someone who had learned English as a second language late in life. "You are a warrior." It was a statement, not a question. Ethan stood slowly, the bloody hide forgotten. "I was. I know, Glorieta Pass, 1862. Ethan felt his blood turn cold. "You were there. I was there. I fought with the Confederate. I fought with the Union. I fought for the land that belonged to neither." The old man's eyes were steady. "My name is Dakota. I live in the valley beyond the ridge. I have watched your smoke for 5 winters." Dakota's gaze shifted to the porch. Ayanna had emerged from her room. She stood frozen, her eyes wide. Dakota spoke to her in Apache, the words flowing like water over stones. Ayanna answered, her voice trembling. They spoke for 2 minutes, a conversation Ethan could not follow, though he caught the rhythm of question and answer, of recognition and grief. Dakota turned back to Ethan and switched to English. "She is the daughter of Nayalnish, a great warrior of our people." Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him. "You killed him," Dakota said quietly. "Glorieta Pass, I saw it." The memory came unbidden. March of 1862. The narrow pass through the mountains, the Confederate supply train they were ordered to destroy. The chaos of the fight. Ethan, 22 years old and not yet hardened by war, was reloading his rifle when the Apache warrior came out of the rocks. A knife in his hand, eyes like burning coals. Ethan had fired without thinking. The bullet took the man in the chest. He fell, but his eyes, those dark almond-shaped eyes, so much like the girls had looked at Ethan for one last second. Ethan had whispered, "I'm sorry," but no one heard. "I didn't know she was—" Ethan began, but the words died in his throat. Dakota held up a hand. "It was war. He died as a warrior dies, but she, his daughter, is now under your roof. The spirits of our ancestors brought her to you. You killed the father. Now you must protect the daughter. This is how balance is made." Ethan could not speak. The weight of it pressed on him like the sky. Dakota spoke to Ayanna again in Apache. She nodded, her eyes glistening. Then Dakota turned back to Ethan. "I live 1 hour's walk from here beyond the aspen grove. If she needs me, call. If you need me, call. We are all that is left." He turned and walked back into the pines. Within 10 steps, he had vanished as silently as he had come. Ethan and Ayanna stood in the cold, the wind moving through the trees. Neither spoke. The circle of history had closed around them, binding them together in ways Ethan did not yet understand. 2 weeks later, Ethan rode into Santa Fe. He needed supplies: salt, coffee, ammunition. The homestead was running low and winter was tightening its grip on the high country. He left Ayanna at home with the Winchester, instructing her to hide if she saw anyone. She nodded, her hand resting on the rifle, her eyes calm. Santa Fe was busy. The plaza was thick with wagons and horses. Men back from winter trap lines crowded the saloons. The adobe storefronts seemed to bake even in the cold December sun. Ethan tied Dusty outside Marcus Webb's general store. He kept his hat pulled low, his gaze down. He just wanted to get in and get out. The moment he pushed open the door, the talk stopped. Marcus Webb was behind the counter polishing a glass jar. 3 men were leaning against the far wall by the unlit stove. Ethan recognized them. Wade Brennan and Rusty Dalton, 2 hands from the Hartford Ranch, and a third man, a drifter he had seen around town. "Cole," Marcus said, his voice flat. Ethan nodded. He moved past the men, gathering what he needed: a sack of flour, another of beans, salt, coffee, 2 heavy boxes of .44 caliber cartridges for the Winchester. Stocking up heavy, Wade Brennan observed. His voice was lazy, but it carried across the small store like a threat. Ethan ignored him. Need corn seed, Marcus, and rye. Marcus moved to scoop the seed into brown paper sacks. His hands were shaking slightly. Heard you got company up on that ridge, Cole, Rusty Dalton said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the sawdust on the floor. Heard you ain't so lonely anymore. Ethan's back stiffened. He kept his eyes on the counter. My business is my own, Rusty. Wade pushed himself off the wall. He was a big man, broad in the shoulders with a mean pinched mouth. Not when it concerns a Christian soul. We heard what you did. Took that little Apache girl from Reverend Crane's wagon. That's stealing coal. That's stealing church property. Reverend Crane bought her like cattle, Ethan said, his voice low and cold. She was half dead when I found her, chained like an animal. She was a convert, Wade sneered, stepping closer. He was saving her soul. And you took her. Heard you're keeping her up there for yourself, ruining a good Christian girl after your half-breed wife died. Guess you got a taste for squaws. The mention of Sarah was a lit match to dry tinder. Ethan felt the blood roar in his ears at a hot red tide that drowned out all reason. He did not think. He moved. He hit Wade Brennan once, a straight, hard right born of military training and fury. It connected with the man's jaw with a sickening crack of bone and cartilage. Wade went down like a felled tree crashing into a barrel of pickles. Glass shattered. Brine splashed across the floor. Rusty and the drifter lunged. Ethan ducked under Rusty's wild swing and drove his fist into the man's stomach, doubling him over. The drifter tried to grab him from behind, but Ethan spun, throwing him off, and slammed his elbow into the man's face. Blood sprayed from the drifter's broken nose. It was over in seconds. The store was a wreck. Flour dusted the floorboards. The sharp scent of brine filled the air. Wade was groaning, holding his jaw. Rusty was on his knees, gasping for air. The drifter was spitting blood. Ethan stood breathing hard, his knuckles split and bleeding. He looked at Marcus, who was pale and wide-eyed behind the counter. Ethan pulled a heavy leather purse from his coat and threw it on the counter. Take what I owe for the supplies and the pickles. He turned to the men on the floor. Wade was trying to get up, his eyes murderous. Ethan walked over and put his boot on the man's chest, pinning him. His voice was not a shout. It was a cold, quiet promise. I don't know what you heard and I don't care, but I'm telling you this once. She is under my protection. If any of you or any man you send comes near my home, if I so much as see your shadow on my land, I will kill you. I will put you in the ground and not think twice on it. Do you understand me? He pressed his boot down harder. Wade choked, his eyes bulging, and nodded frantically. Ethan removed his boot. He grabbed his sacks of supplies, his ammunition, and his seed, and walked out. A voice stopped him on the boardwalk. Mr. Cole, a moment of your time. Ethan turned. The man was tall and thin, dressed in black with a white clerical collar. His eyes were a pale, cold blue. He carried a black leather satchel. I am Reverend Josiah Crane, the man said, as if Ethan should know the name. I am here on God's business in the territory. I have no business with you, Ethan said, turning back to Dusty. You have my property, sir, Crane said, his voice sharp. The Apache girl, Ayanna. She is a ward of the mission entrusted to my care by the United States government to be educated and saved. You abducted her. Ethan turned slowly. She was chained to your wagon, half dead and beaten. The bandits left her. I saved her. You stole her, Crane said. His thin lips curled. You are harboring a fugitive. You are cohabitating with her in sin. I have papers. He produced a sheaf of documents from his satchel. Legal papers, a wardship agreement. The seal of the Territorial Court of New Mexico was embossed on the top page. The signature was that of Judge Clayton R. Morrison. The date March of 1878. Ayanna Nyalnish, female Indian, age, approximately 18, placed under guardianship of Reverend Josiah Crane for Christian education and civilization until age 21. Ethan stared at the papers. The seal was real. The signature was real. This was not a simple matter of running Crane out of town. This was law. She is not property, Ethan said, and she is not going anywhere with you. Sheriff, Crane called out. Sheriff Tom Garrett emerged from his office across the plaza. He was a weary man in his 50s, his face lined from the sun and the stress of policing a territory that was mostly lawless. He walked toward them, his spurs jingling in the dust. "Ethan," he said, his voice tired. "Reverend's been to see me. He's got papers. They look legal." "Legal?" Ethan's voice was incredulous. "He's a slaver, Tom." "He claims he was transporting her from a difficult situation," Garrett said, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, his papers say she's a ward of the church until she's 21. He's claiming you're holding her against her will. That's a serious charge." "That's a lie," Ethan said. "Then let her come to town and say it." Crane challenged, his blue eyes gleaming. "Let her testify that she came with you willingly." "She's not setting foot in this town," Ethan said, his hand moving toward the pistol on his hip. "Ethan, don't," Garrett said, his hand on his own weapon. "Don't be a fool. This is a civil matter. You draw on him, it's murder." "If he comes near my land, it's self-defense," Ethan said. Crane smiled, a cold, thin expression. "You will be served with a writ, Mr. Cole. You are defying the law. You are defying God." The preacher turned and walked away, his black coat flapping. Garrett let out a long breath. He stepped closer to Ethan, lowering his voice. "Listen to me, Cole. I don't give a damn what you do on that ridge. But he's right. His papers look good. He's been talking to men. Brennan, Dalton. He's telling them you're a squaw man, a sinner, that you stole a Christian convert." "What are you saying, Tom?" "I'm saying I've got 2 deputies. I can't police the whole county. If Crane comes back and he brings men with him, if he brings a posse to reclaim his property, I can't stop them. The law will be on his side. You'll be on your own." Ethan did not reply. He mounted Dusty and rode out of Santa Fe, not looking back. The ride home was long. The fury slowly cooled into a deep, cold ache. He was a fool. He had lost his temper. He had not just borrowed trouble. He had invited it home to supper. He had painted a target on his own back and on hers. He reached the homestead as the sun was setting, bleeding red into the western sky. He was exhausted, sore, and heartsick. Ayanna was waiting on the porch. She always knew somehow when he was close. She watched him dismount, her face calm. He pulled the heavy sacks from Dusty, his movements stiff. She saw him turn. The light was fading, but she saw the purple-black swelling around his left eye. She saw the dried blood on his knuckles. She said nothing. She stepped back, holding the door open as he carried the supplies inside. He dropped them on the floor, his body slumping with the fatigue. He sat heavily in his chair, wincing as his bruised ribs protested. She went to the dry sink. She poured water from the bucket into a small bowl, took a clean cloth, and walked to the medicine tin. She pulled out the familiar tin of salve. She knelt in front of him. "It's nothing," he said, "just a brawl." She ignored him. Her fingers, so small and delicate, were surprisingly firm. She dipped the cloth in the water and gently began to clean the cut on his knuckle. He hissed as the water stung. "Hold still," she commanded, her voice low. She cleaned his hand, her touch methodical. Then she moved to his face. She dabbed at the swelling around his eye, her touch impossibly light. He sat frozen, watching her. Her face was inches from his, her expression one of intense, unwavering focus. Her brows were knit, her lips pressed together. She was not afraid. She was angry. Her hands were trembling at a fine, deep tremor. She finished cleaning the cut over his eye. She opened the salve and gently applied it to his skin. Her fingers were so light they barely touched him. "No one," she whispered. Her voice was so quiet he almost did not hear it. She did not look up from her work. "No one ever bled for me." The words hit him harder than Wade's fist. He realized in that moment that every man in her life had been a source of pain, a taker. He was the first one to ever take pain on her behalf. He reached up with his uninjured hand and covered hers where it rested on his cheek. Her skin was warm. The trembling passed from her to him. "They won't come here," he said, his voice rough. "I made sure of that." She finally looked at him. Her eyes were dark, and in their depths he saw something new. Not gratitude, not curiosity. It was a fierce, possessive, terrible understanding. She saw his wound not as a weakness, but as a brand. He had been marked. He was hers. That night, the space between them began to close. But neither of them knew yet how far they would have to go or what they would have to sacrifice to keep the promise he had just made. In the high country, winter was coming, and with it, a reckoning that would test everything Ethan Cole thought he knew about honor law and the price of love. December deepened into January. The high country winter settled over the valley like a cold fist closing. Snow fell in the nights, not the heavy, wet snow of lower elevations, but the dry, crystalline powder that squeaked under boots and reflected the starlight like scattered diamonds. The temperature dropped to where spit froze before it hit the ground. The creek slowed to a trickle, then stopped entirely locked in ice. Ethan worked from first light to last. The labor was relentless, unforgiving. He split wood until his shoulders burned and his palms bled. Pinon for the slow, steady heat, aspen for the quick morning fires, cedar for its insect-repelling properties. Each day required 40 to 50 pounds of fuel to keep both fires burning through the night. He stacked the wood under the porch in cords 4 feet high and 8 feet long, a wall of labor that would barely see them through to March. The fences needed constant repair. 50 posts had to be replaced before the ground froze solid as iron. He worked with a pickaxe to break the frozen earth, then set the split rail posts and tamped them firm. Ayanna held the post steady while he worked, her small hands gripping the rough wood, her breath coming out in white plumes. They ground corn together using the stone matati and mano, the ancient tools of her people that Sarah had taught him to use years before. Each bushel of corn required 2 hours of rhythmic grinding the stone against stone, producing a sound like distant thunder. They needed 5 bushels a month for flour and meal. Ayanna learned the rhythm quickly, her body swaying with the motion, her face calm and focused. In the evenings, when the work was done and the fires were banked, Ethan began to teach her English. He had no formal training as a teacher. He had barely finished the 8th grade himself before his father put him to work in the forge. But he knew words, and he knew that words were power in this country. A woman who could not speak English could not testify in court, could not sign her name, could not say no in a language that men with guns would recognize. He used charcoal from the fire to write on the smooth planks of the table. He started with concrete nouns, things she could see and touch. C-U-P, he tapped the tin mug. Cup. She watched her brow furrowed. P. F-I-R-E. He pointed to the hearth. Fire. F-I-R. She repeated, her tongue clumsy around the sounds. W-A-T-E-R. B-L-A-N-K-E-T. H-O-R-S-E. D-E-E-R. S-N-O-W-E-R-E-M. She was a fierce student. She learned with the same intensity she applied to chopping wood. She demanded more each night, pointing to objects and waiting for him to name them, then repeating the words 10, 20 times until her pronunciation was precise. He found the old primer he had bought 5 years ago when Sarah was pregnant, and they had dreams of a daughter who would read Shakespeare and understand mathematics. The book was water-stained, the pages yellowed, but the simple sentences were still legible. The dog runs, the cat sits, the horse eats, the fire burns. Ayanna traced the letters with her finger, her lips moving as she sounded out the words. One night she looked up from the book, her eyes bright with a sudden, painful understanding. She touched the page. Words, she whispered. They stay, not go away like breath. Ethan felt his throat close. That's right, he said, his voice thick. They stay. They're a kind of memory. She found a word in the primer and pointed to it. L-O-V-E. What this? She asked. Ethan looked at the word, such a small word. 4 letters, but it carried the weight of the world. Love, he said. It's what you feel for your family, for your home, for someone special. She traced the letters slowly, deliberately. Love, she said, her pronunciation perfect. She looked up at him. It stays. He nodded. Yes, it stays. Ayanna began to share her world with him in return. She no longer sang only in the privacy of her room. She sang as she worked low melodic chants that spoke of the land and the seasons and the spirits that moved through all living things. The songs were simple, repetitive, hypnotic. They filled the cabin with a sound it had never known, a feminine voice that softened the hard edges of Ethan's solitary existence. One evening as she ground corn, she sang a particular melody, her voice rising and falling like wind through pines. Ethan, sharpening his knife by the fire, stopped to listen. What does it mean? He asked when she finished. She looked up, surprised that he had asked. Her English was better now, though still halting. This one, she said, her hands continuing in the grinding motion for corn. Ask mother. Wake up. Feed us. The corn has a mother, Ethan asked. Everything has mother, she said simply. Corn mother, dear mother, thunder father, wind grandfather. What about that one you sing in the morning? That one for thunder. Thank him for the wash skemmy, so deer can see, so we can hunt. She taught him another song, one she said was for children to sleep. Say wind sing hawk, fly fire warm, child safe, spirits watch. Ethan tried to learn the Apache words. He repeated them after her, his throat unused to the glottal stops and the subtle vowel shifts. He butchered the sounds terribly. Ayanna stopped grinding. Her hand came up to cover her mouth. A sound bubbled up from her chest. Laughter. Not a smile, not a quiet expression of contentment. Real laughter, light, unrestrained, joyful. The sound startled them both. Ethan stared at her. It was the first time he had heard true, uncomplicated joy in this cabin. It was the first time he had heard her laugh. It was a sound he wanted to hear again, a sound that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. She covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide, as if surprised by her own capacity for happiness. I am sorry, she said. Don't be sorry, Ethan said, smiling, despite himself. Don't ever be sorry for that. The laughter changed something between them. It opened a door that had been locked. After that night, she smiled more freely. She asked more questions. She sat closer to him by the fire. They developed a comfortable silence, a way of being together that required no words. Ethan would work on mending tack, oiling the leather, stitching torn reins. Ayanna would sew moccasins from the deer hide he had tanned, her needle moving with quick, sure strokes. The fire would crackle, the wind would whisper against the walls, and the silence between them was no longer lonely. One night a winter storm hammered the valley. The wind was a living thing slamming against the cabin walls with fists of ice. Ethan brought Ayanna into the main room. Her small fireplace could not fight the deep cold that seeped through the walls. She sat on the bearskin rug watching the flames dance in the main hearth. Ethan sat in his chair working on a bridle, his hands stiff from the cold. He had a scar on the back of his right hand, a puckered white mark where a hot iron had branded him during the war. He rubbed it absently, a nervous habit. Ayanna moved. She crawled silently across the rug and stopped beside his chair. Ethan tensed but did not pull away. She reached out. Her fingers light as a moth's wing traced the scar on his hand. The touch sent a jolt through him, a feeling so long forgotten, it almost hurt. He had not been touched with tenderness in 5 years. He looked down at her. She was staring at his hand, her expression one of simple, unfiltered curiosity. Her English was still broken, learned from listening to him mutter to Dusty and to himself. But her words when they came were clear. She looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. Why patoi? She asked, her voice soft. Your heart sleep alone. The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Ethan froze. It was a perfectly aimed arrow slipping past all his defenses. Too intimate. Too true. He had no answer for her, none that would not break him open. He saw Sarah's face in the fire, felt the phantom weight of a swaddled infant in his arms, the terrible lightness of a body that held no life. He gently pulled his hand from Ayanna's grasp. He stood up, his movement stiff. He turned from her, busying himself with the fire, poking at logs that did not need poking. It's late, he said, his voice thick. You should sleep. She watched him for a moment longer, her eyes searching his face for an answer he could not give. Then she rose and slipped back into her own room. He heard the soft slide of the latch. Ethan did not go to bed. He stood by the cold window, staring out at the white, empty darkness. He had not cried in 5 years, not since the day he buried his wife and child. He did not cry now. He just felt the great cold weight of his solitude, a weight that for one brief moment another person had offered to share. That night, when he finally fell onto his cot, he dreamed. He dreamed of holding someone, of the warmth of a body pressed against his, of the scent of wood smoke and pine, and the simple, uncomplicated peace of not being alone. He woke before dawn, the ache in his chest sharper than any winter cold. In the days that followed, Ethan tried to create distance. He spoke less. He kept his gaze fixed on his work. He tried to be colder, more remote. But his distance only seemed to make her more determined. She was like a plant seeking the sun, and she had decided he was it. The more he withdrew, the more she pressed forward. Late February brought the first thaw. The snow began to melt in earnest, running in silver streams down from the peaks. The creek swelled from a trickle to a rushing, muddy torrent. The air was still sharp, but the sun carried a fragile warmth that promised spring. The need for a real bath, one that was not a sponge and a cold basin in the cabin, became overwhelming. Ethan took his rifle and his bar of lye soap and headed down to the sheltered bend in the creek where the water pooled deeper. He told himself he was going to hunt, but he left Ayana at the cabin. He needed a moment alone away from her presence, away from the questions in her eyes. The water was so cold it stole his breath. He stripped down to nothing and waited in his body, rebelling at the shock. He scrubbed himself quickly, the harsh soap biting his skin. He was washing his hair, his head dunked under the water, when he surfaced and found her standing on the bank. She was holding his towel. "Jesus!" Ethan yelled, stumbling back into the deeper water, dunking himself to his shoulders. "Ayana, what are you doing here? Get back to the cabin." "You hunt," she said, her voice calm, "but you bring soap." Ethan felt the blood rush to his face, a heat that had nothing to do with the icy water. "Go, now." She did not go. She sat on a rock, her back to him, and waited. Ethan was trapped. He could not get out without exposing himself. He stayed in the freezing water until his teeth were chattering and his feet were numb, until his fingers turned blue and he could no longer feel his toes. "Damn it, woman," he finally shouted. "Turn around, all the way." He heard her shift on the rock. "I am turned," she said. He waited, not trusting, but the cold was killing him. He climbed out, his skin blue, and grabbed the towel, wrapping it around his waist. He was shaking as much from anger as from cold. "You can't do that," he said through chattering teeth. "You can't just follow me. Must give a man his privacy." She stood and faced him. She looked at the towel, then at his chest, then at his face. "You dirty. Now clean. I not understand privacy." "It means alone," Ethan said. "Means where people can't see you." "I see you every day," she said. "Why water different?" He had no answer. He dressed quickly, his fingers clumsy on the buttons, numb from the cold. As he was pulling on his boots, she came closer. She knelt beside him, her eyes fixed on his left leg. He had forgotten about the scar. It was on his thigh, a puckered, ugly knot of tissue where a Confederate mini-A ball had torn through the muscle during the war. The scar was white against his skin, a permanent reminder of Glorieta Pass and the men who had died there. Before he could react, she reached out and touched it. Her finger traced the edge of the wound, following the ridged flesh. "This one bad," she whispered. "It was a long time ago." Ethan set his voice tight. He tried to pull his leg back, but she held it fast. She leaned down. Her black hair fell forward, brushing against his skin. She pressed her lips softly to the scar. It was not a kiss of passion. It was like her question about his chest. It was an act of acknowledgement, a reverence for the wound, for the fact that he had survived it. But it ripped through him like a bolt of lightning. He jerked his leg back so fast he almost kicked her. "No," he said sharply. "Don't ever do that." He grabbed his rifle and stalked back to the cabin, leaving her by the creek. That night, the fragile peace between them was shattered. Ethan sat in his chair, cleaning the Winchester, pointedly ignoring her. Ayana sat by her own fire in her small room, the door open. He could feel her watching him. The silent stretch filled with his resistance and her confusion. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was small, coming from the shadows of her room. "The men, before black coat." Ethan stopped cleaning. He did not look at her. "What about them?" he asked. "They hurt me." He closed his eyes. He had known, of course. He had seen the terror in her that first day, the old bruises, the way she flinched from male touch. But hearing her say it here in the safety of his home made his stomach clench. "They white men," she continued, struggling for the words. "Soldiers, maybe. Find me after family." Her voice broke on the last word. "They put hands on me, do things. When done, they sell me to preacher." Ethan set the rifle down. He looked at her. She was just a shape in the shadows, illuminated by her own small fire. "Ayana," he said, his voice thick. "You don't have to tell me this." "They hurt me," she repeated, her voice stronger now, as if saying it aloud gave it a shape he could understand. "Was cold. When they touched me, was cold and hard, like stone." She stood and came into the main room, stopping a few feet from his chair. She looked at his shirt, at the place over his heart. "But not like you," she whispered. "You warm." Ethan wanted to reach for her. He wanted to hold her and tell her that nothing cold would ever touch her again. But he knew with a sickening certainty that if he touched her now, he would be no different from them. She was not seeing him. She was seeing a protector, a source of heat. She was a half-drowned woman reaching for a log, and he could not let her mistake that for love. He stood, but he did not move toward her. He kept his hands at his sides, clenched into fists. "You are safe here, Ayana," he said, his voice rough. "I told you that. I meant it. No one will hurt you." "I not hurt," she said, looking up at him. "I safe, but I not warm." She turned and went back to her room, and this time he heard the wooden latch slide firmly into place. A week later, the storm came. It was not a winter blizzard, but a violent spring squall, the kind that brought the sky down to the earth. Rain and hail hammered the roof, driven by a wind that shrieked like a grieving woman. Thunder cracked overhead so close the cabin shuddered with each blow. Ethan was checking the door latch when a bolt of lightning struck a pine tree on the ridge above the cabin. The explosion of light and sound was simultaneous. The cabin was lit white for a second, bright as noon, and the crash was deafening. Every board shook. The air smelled of ozone and burning wood. The door to Ayana's room flew open. She stood there, her eyes wide with terror, her hands pressed to her ears. The storms of her childhood, the thunder of guns, the violence of men. It was all one and the same to her. "It's just lightning, Ayana," Ethan shouted over the wind. "It's all right." She ran to him, not to his chair, but to his cot where he had been preparing to sleep. She scrambled onto it and buried her face in his blankets, her body shaking violently. Ethan sighed. He sat on the edge of the cot, rubbing her back in a clumsy paternal way. "It'll pass," he said. "It's just a storm." "Hold me," she whimpered, her voice muffled by the wool. He hesitated, but the cabin shook again, and she cried out a sound of pure animal fear. He slid onto the cot, pulling her back against his chest, wrapping his arms around her as he would a frightened child. He was still fully dressed, his boots on the floor beside the bed. He pulled a blanket over both of them. "See," he said, his voice rumbling in her ear. "It's just noise. Can't hurt you in here." She slowly relaxed. Her trembling subsided. They lay like that for a long time, the storm raging around them, the sound of the rain a deafening drum on the roof. He could feel her breathing, feel the warmth of her back through his shirt. It was a simple, profound comfort. He had not held another person in 5 years. He had forgotten what it felt like. The weight of her, the realness of her, the way her presence pushed back the vast emptiness that had consumed him since Sarah died. He thought she had fallen asleep. The storm was easing, the thunder rolling away into the distant mountains. His own eyes were heavy. Then she moved. She turned in his arms, her body flush against his, her face inches from his in the dark. "Ethan," she whispered. "It's all right," he said, his voice thick with exhaustion. "Go to sleep." "No, She pressed her hand flat against his chest over his heart. He could feel the warmth of her palm through the fabric of his shirt. "I want to feel what women feel." His blood went cold, then hot. He knew exactly what she meant. "Ayana, no," he said. "This is not—" "I want warm," she insisted, her voice no longer frightened, but full of that same direct, honest curiosity that had marked every question she had asked him. "I want to know." She pushed herself up, her lips near his. He stopped her. He gripped her shoulders firmly and held her at arm's length. She was a shadow in the dark, but he could see the glint of her eyes. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "What those men did, they took something from you. What you're asking for now, it's not just the warm. It's not just to know. Do you understand me?" She stared at him, confused, her breathing quick. "This," he said, his grip on her shoulders gentle but absolute, "between a man and a woman. It's meant to be more than just heat. It's supposed to be a choice. It's supposed to be about tenderness, about safety. Not just safety from a storm, but safety with that person." He let out a breath, struggling to find the words. "You deserve more than just heat, Ayana. You deserve a choice. A real one, Vic. Not one you make in the dark during a storm because you're scared or because you're grateful I'm not them. It has to be more." He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I will not be just another man who takes from you." She was silent. He could feel the resistance in her, the incomprehension. She was offering the only thing she had, and he was refusing it. He felt her pull away. She slid off the cot. She stood in the middle of the room for a moment, a silhouette against the fading storm. He could not read her expression. He had hurt her, he was sure of it. He had rejected her. Without a word, she went back to her room and quietly closed the door. He did not hear the latch. Ethan lay awake until dawn, his body aching with a tension that was both desire and shame. He had done the right thing. He had protected her even from herself. But as the first gray light filled the cabin, he felt more alone than ever. He must have drifted off because he woke to the smell of coffee and smoke. He sat up, his back stiff from the cot. The storm was gone. The cabin was quiet. He dreaded facing her. He expected her to be gone, to have run, or worse, to be back as she was when she first arrived, a silent, wary ghost. He got up and splashed cold water on his face from the basin. He opened the cabin door. Ayana was outside feeding the chickens a handful of cracked corn. The morning air was washed clean and the sun was bright. She seemed calm, her movements deliberate. He was about to speak, to apologize, to try and explain again when she turned. Her hair. It was not in the simple loose braids she usually wore, the style of a young unmarried girl. It was different. It was parted in the center, pulled back tight, and woven into two intricate braids, which were then looped and tied up at the back of her head with a strip of his own cured leather. It was a style that was severe, complex, and elegant. It was the style of a married woman. Ethan just stared. She did not look at him directly. She scattered the last of the corn for the hens. She stood her back straight and looked toward the mountains, not at him. But her voice was clear and steady, with no trace of the fear or the pleading from the night before. In my tribe, she said, this is how married women wear their hair. The weeks that followed were filled with a new charged silence. Ayana did not speak of the married braids again. She simply wore them every day, a quiet declaration that needed no words. Ethan saw them each morning when she emerged to feed the chickens. He saw them when she sat across from him at meals. He saw them when she worked beside him, her hands sure and steady. He tried to maintain the distance. He tried to be noble. But the distance was killing him. It was a warm afternoon in late February when everything changed. The sun was unusually strong for the season, melting the last patches of snow into silver streams. Ayana was in the new room, stitching a deerskin shirt. Ethan was repairing a saddle on the porch. She called to him softly, "Ethan, come." He went to her doorway, stopping at the threshold as he always did. She was sitting on the cot, the shirt forgotten in her lap. The afternoon light streamed through the small window, catching the braids in her hair, making them shine like black water. "You still treat me like stranger," she said, her English much improved now. "You build room, you give lock, but you treat like I am glass. Break if you touch." "Ayana," he began, but she stood cutting him off. "I am not glass, I am woman. I choose you." She touched the married braids. "In my people way, this mean I am yours. In your people way, what must I do? What words? What promise?" Ethan's throat was tight. "There are no words that matter more than what you've already said." She stepped closer. "Then why you stay so far?" He could not answer. She reached up and touched his face, her palm resting against his bearded cheek. It was the same tender gesture she had used to clean his wounds, but this time it lingered. "I want to try," she whispered, echoing her first words to him months ago, but with a different meaning now. "Can I try too?" This time when she asked, Ethan understood that she was not asking out of fear or gratitude or curiosity. She was asking as a woman who had chosen freely and fully to give herself to a man she trusted. "Yes," he said, his voice breaking. "Yes." He stepped across the threshold. He pulled her to him, not with the desperate need of a man taking, but with the reverence of a man receiving a gift he did not deserve. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, and finally her lips tasting salt and sunshine, and the promise of something he thought he had lost forever. What happened in that sun-warmed room was tender and slow and full of a care that neither of them had known before. It was not the violence she had endured. It was not the grief he had carried. It was something entirely new. When it was over, they lay together on the narrow cot, her head on his chest, his hand stroking her hair, unraveling the married braids until her hair fell loose and free around them both. "Now," she whispered against his skin, "now I am warm." Outside, the wind sang through the pines, and inside, two broken people became whole. But winter was ending. Spring was coming, And with it, Ethan knew would come Reverend Crane and the law, and the reckoning he had been trying to avoid. One morning in early March, Ayanna woke him with her hand on his arm. It was still dark outside. Her face was pale in the dim light from the banked fire. "Ethan," she whispered. He sat up instantly, alert, reaching for the rifle by his bed. "What is it?" "What's wrong?" "The dream," she said, her voice strange. "A nightmare?" he asked, his panic easing slightly. "No, not bad dream." She sat up, pulling the blanket around her. "Different. Tell me." "You know I dream of deer," she said. He nodded. She had told him once weeks ago that she often dreamed of running through the forest, chased by something she could not name. And in those dreams there was always a deer running ahead of her, fleeing. "Before," she said, her voice full of a strange awe, "deer see me, it afraid, it run away. Always run." She turned to look at him, her face a pale oval in the moonlight filtering through the window. "Tonight it not run. It follow me, walk beside me in aspens. Not afraid, just with me." Ethan stared at her. The deer followed her, a quiet, companionable animal. A fawn. His mind, slow with sleep, began to work. The sickness in the morning, the weariness, the turning from meat. He did not know much about these things. Sarah had kept the mysteries of her body mostly to herself. But he knew the basics. He had lived through one pregnancy, even if it had ended in tragedy. His voice was tight, almost a croak. "Ayanna, your monthly time, your bleed, it has not come for how long?" She looked at him, confused by the question. She thought, her head tilted. "Since snowmelt, since night of storm." The night of the storm. No, not that night. The night she had asked him. The day she had worn his shirt. The day he had finally surrendered to what they both wanted. He counted in his head. Late March now. If she had not bled since early February, that was nearly 2 months. The breath left his body. "Ayanna," he said, his voice shaking. "I think the deer, it means a child." She looked at him, uncomprehending. "A baby," he said, his hand moving, hovering over her stomach. "You are carrying our child." Her eyes widened. Her own hand came up to cover his, pressing it against her belly, still flat beneath the thin nightshirt she wore. A child. Her child. Their child. The idea was so foreign, so impossible. She had asked, "Can I try too?" as a child might ask to try a new food. She had not truly understood the consequence, had not imagined that her body could hold this power, this miracle. "A baby," she whispered, testing the word. A small, slow smile, the one he had seen when she was grinding corn and humming, spread across her face. "Our baby." Mom, Ethan felt two things at once. The first was a surge of pure, unadulterated joy, so fierce it was like a blow to the chest. A child, a son, a daughter, a second chance, a family. He wanted to laugh, to shout, to swing her around. But the joy was immediately choked by a cold, sharp terror. He thought of Wade Brennan's face, twisted with hate. Half-breed. He stood abruptly and began to pace the small cabin, his bare feet stirring the dust. A child. A child born of a white man and an Apache woman in New Mexico territory in 1879. What world was he bringing this baby into? A world that would hate it. A world that would see it as a sin, a bastard, a thing to be despised. "Ethan," Ayanna asked, her voice small, her smile fading. He ran his hands through his hair, his heart hammering with a new protective fury. "We have to be careful," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "No one can know, not yet. We need time. We need—" He did not finish the sentence. But he knew what they needed. They needed a miracle, because Reverend Crane was still out there. The law was still against them, and now they had something even more precious to protect. Ayanna stood and walked to him. She placed her small hand on his chest over his racing heart. "We stay," she said, her voice firm. "This our place, this our child. We not run." Ethan looked down at her, at the determination in her eyes, at the married braids in her hair, at the hand resting protectively over her still flat belly. She was right. Running meant they would always be running. Here at least he knew the ground. Here he could fight. "All right," he said quietly. "We stay, but we do it my way." The spring sun was rising, painting the eastern sky in shades of gold and rose. In the high country, new life was stirring. The aspens would soon bud. the deer would return to the high meadows. And in a small cabin on a remote ridge, a man and a woman who had both known terrible loss were about to discover what it meant to fight not just for survival, but for hope. The reckoning was coming. But for now, in the quiet dawn, they had each other, and that Ethan thought might just be enough. Spring came to the high country like a promise kept. The snow retreated up the mountains, leaving the valleys green and alive. The aspens budded their leaves, trembling in the wind like thousands of small hands. The creeks, swollen with snowmelt, roared down from the peaks, carrying the winter away. The air smelled of wet earth and pine resin and new growth. Ayana's pregnancy became undeniable as April turned to May. The sickness passed. Her appetite returned with a vengeance. She ate everything Ethan put in front of her and asked for more. Her body began to change, the gentle rounding of her belly visible beneath her dress by the end of May. Ethan watched her with a mixture of wonder and terror. He had lived through this once before. He remembered Sarah's pregnancy, the way she had glowed with health in the early months, the way she had laughed and planned and dreamed. He remembered, too, the way it had ended. The screaming, the blood, the silence. He tried not to think about it. He threw himself into work instead. He looked at the cabin, his one-room fortress of solitude, and saw that it was not enough. It was a shelter for one, a cramped space for two. It was not a home for three. So he began to build. He took his axe and his saw and went to the woods, felling trees with a new focused energy. He was not just splitting firewood. He was hewing beams. He worked from sunup to sundown, the sound of his hammer and saw echoing through the valley. He was expanding the cabin, adding a new proper room with a wide window to catch the morning light. He built it strong, the timbers chinked tight against the wind. It was a room for the child. Ayana would sit on the porch, stitching soft deerskin. He had tanned, her eyes following him. She was making small clothes, impossibly small, sewn with a bone needle and sinew. She watched his muscles work, watched the sweat on his back. She saw the same strength he had used to kill the men who had come for her, now being used to build a roof over their child's head. When the room was finished, the walls smelling of fresh-cut pine, he did not stop. He spent days searching the creek bed, looking for the right piece of wood. He found it finally, a length of smooth, pale aspen cured dry by the sun. He brought it into the cabin, and in the evenings by firelight, he began to carve. His hands, thick and calloused, scarred from war and work, moved with surprising delicacy. Ayana watched him, her head tilted as the wood chips fell. He was making a cradle. It was not fine or fancy. It was solid, deep, and strong. He sanded it with smooth river stones until the wood felt like silk. When he was finished, he set it in the new room in the patch of sunlight from the new window. He did not stop there. The protective, joyful energy consumed him. He carved small, simple toys, his mind filled with the image of a small hand reaching. He carved a deer, its head held high in memory of her dream. He carved a small, smooth bird. He carved a rough, solid horse, just like Dusty. He lined them up on the windowsill, a small, silent herd waiting. As her time grew near, their roles reversed. She who had learned his world now began to teach him hers. In the evenings, she would hum the low melodic songs of her people. "You must learn," she told him, her hand on her belly. "Baby, know my voice. Must know yours too." "I can't sing, Ayana," he said, his voice rough. "You can," she insisted. She began a song, a simple, repetitive chant. It was a lullaby, she explained, to soothe the child. It spoke of the wind and the pines, of the hawk on the wing, of the safety of the fire. He tried. His voice was a low, tuneless rumble, butchering the soft Apache words. She laughed, the sound light, and made him try again and again. He sat beside her, his head bent, and he learned. He learned the songs of a people he had once been paid to fight so that he could sing his own child to sleep. One evening in late May, as the last light was fading from the sky, Ayana asked him a question. "Can we go to her?" she asked quietly. "To who?" Ethan looked up from the leather he was working. "Your wife, Sarah. I want to see." Ethan's heart clenched. He had not been to the grave since the day he buried them 5 years ago. He had told himself it was respect, that he was leaving them in peace. But he knew it was cowardice. He was afraid of the pain, afraid of the guilt that would come from loving someone new, while Sarah lay cold in the ground. But Ayana was looking at him with those dark, steady eyes, and he could not refuse her. He took her hand. He said nothing, just led her from the cabin past the corral, up the small pine-covered ridge that overlooked their valley. The grave was there beneath the largest pinon. The wooden cross he had carved was gray and weathered by 5 winters. The mound of stones was undisturbed exactly as he had left it. Ayanna stopped when she saw it. She knew what it was. Her people did not mark their dead this way, but she understood the meaning of a quiet, separate place. Ethan stood before it, his hat in his hands. "This is Sarah's grave," he said, his voice low. "My wife." He spoke, his voice thick with emotion, telling her about the woman who had been Comanche and Irish, who had loved this high, lonely country. He told her about the birth, about the long, terrible night, about the snow falling outside, as he held his wife's cold hand and listened to the silence of the child who had never cried. "I buried them here," he finished, his voice rough. "Together. It was 5 years ago." Ayanna listened, her gaze moving from his face to the wooden cross. She saw the story not in his words, but in the lines around his eyes, in the permanent set of his shoulders. She understood finally the source of the profound sadness he carried. She did not speak. She stepped past him to the grave. From a small leather pouch at her belt, she pulled a necklace. It was not a grand thing. It was a single, smooth, white shell, intricately carved with small crossing lines strung on a simple leather thong. It was one of the few possessions she had kept, a relic from a life he could not imagine. She bent and laid the shell necklace on the mound of stones carefully, so it rested just beneath the carved name. She stood and faced him. She put her small, warm hand on his chest. "She was first," Ayanna said, her voice soft. "She was yours. She let me have you now." Ethan looked from the white shell on the dark stones to Ayanna's clear, steady eyes. He had expected her to be jealous or confused. He had not expected this. A simple, profound acceptance. A blessing. He felt a weight he had carried for 5 years, a weight of fidelity to a ghost suddenly lift. He pulled her to him, burying his face in her hair. And for the first time, he felt not like a man betraying a memory, but a man permitted to live again. Summer deepened. The heat settled in the valley, but the nights remained cool. The corn they had planted was shoulder high. Ayanna's belly grew round and full. She moved more slowly now with a new deliberation, one hand often resting on the swell of her stomach. By late July, Ethan knew he could not put it off any longer. They were out of salt, low on coffee, and dangerously low on ammunition. The ground was soft enough to plant the fall crops, and he needed seed. More than that, Ayanna would need things for the baby. Soft cloth, if he could find a cow to buy milk. He had to go to Santa Fe. He left her with the Winchester, made her promise to keep it loaded to hide if she saw anyone. She promised, her hand resting protectively on her belly, a gesture that had become natural to her. He rode into Santa Fe with a heavy heart, his eyes scanning every alley, every rooftop. The town felt hostile. The air, which had been lazy and warm, now felt charged with menace. He went to Marcus Webb's general store. Marcus served him, his face a sour mask. He would not meet Ethan's eyes. The store was empty. The silence was heavy. Ethan was loading his sacks onto Dusty when a voice stopped him. "Mr. Cole, a moment of your time." Ethan turned. Reverend Josiah Crane stood on the boardwalk, flanked by 2 men. One was a stranger, lean and hard-eyed. The other was Wade Brennan, his face still swollen and discolored from their fight months ago, a livid scar running from the corner of his mouth to his ear. "Reverend," Ethan said, his voice flat. His hand moved closer to the Colt at his hip. "I have returned as I promised," Crane said. His pale blue eyes were cold. "With the proper authorities." The lean man stepped forward. He wore a deputy's badge, but Ethan did not recognize him. Not one of Garrett's men. "Territorial Marshal," the man said. "Name's Coulter. I'm here on behalf of Judge Morrison to enforce the wardship papers for one Ayanna Nayalnish." "She's not going anywhere with you," Ethan said. "She doesn't have a choice," Crane said, smiling that thin, cold smile. "And neither do you. The law is clear. She is my ward until she turns 21. That's 3 more years, Mr. Cole. 3 years during which I am responsible for her education, her moral instruction, and her spiritual salvation." "You're a slaver," Ethan said. "You bought her. You chained her like an animal." "Prove it," Crane said softly. "Prove it in a court of law, Mr. Cole. I have papers, signed by a federal judge. What do you have?" "The word of a savage who can barely speak English." Marshal Coulter cleared his throat. Cole, I don't want trouble, but I got my orders. You either bring her in peaceful or I come get her with a posse. Your choice, my Marshal Mayo. And if I refuse, then you're obstructing justice. That's a federal crime. I'll arrest you and I'll take her anyway. Ethan felt the trap closing around him. Crane had planned this carefully. He had waited until summer when travel was easy. He had brought a federal marshal, not just Sheriff Garrett, who might have been sympathetic. He had the law on his side and he knew it. I need time, Ethan said. You have 3 days, Coulter said. Bring her to Santa Fe by Saturday noon, or I'm coming for her. And Cole, don't make me chase you. I will find you, and when I do, it won't go well for you. Crane smiled. I look forward to resuming my sacred duty, Mr. Cole. The girl has been living in sin. She will need extensive re-education. Ethan did not trust himself to speak. He mounted Dusty and rode out of Santa Fe, his mind a black storm. He did not buy the soft cloth for the baby. He left the salt and the coffee. He just rode Dusty's hooves, pounding the hard-packed trail, carrying him back to the only place that had ever felt like home. He burst into the cabin just before sunset. Ayanna was sitting at the table, carefully writing her name on a piece of slate. A-I-W-C-N. She looked up, startled by his entrance. He's here, Ethan said, his voice harsh. The preacher, with a federal marshal. They have papers, legal papers. They're coming for you. He grabbed his spare rifle from the rack, checking the action. He began stuffing boxes of cartridges into a saddlebag. We have 3 days, he said. We have to go now, into the high mountains. We can follow the Rio Grande up into the high passes. They won't find us there. We can winter in the canyons. We have to leave. He was frantic, grabbing blankets, jerky, his mind racing. He was seeing her chained to the wagon again, seeing her terror, her blood. He would not let that happen. He would die first. Ayanna watched him. She listened to his words, his panic filling the small room they had built together. He was a soldier, and his instinct was to move, to run, to find a defensible position. She did not move. She was perfectly, terribly still. When he had finished, when he stood breathing heavily, a rifle in one hand and a bag in the other, she finally spoke. She walked past him to the cabin door. She looked out. She looked at the small field of green corn, an impossible splash of life in the dry country. She looked at the new timbers on the roof at the room he had built for their child. She looked at the corral that held Dusty at the 6 chickens she fed every morning. She touched the wooden door frame, the wood smooth beneath her hand. Then she turned to face him. Her eyes were not filled with fear. They were hard as the desert rock. No, she said. Ayanna, you don't understand, Ethan began. They will take you. They will take the baby. No, she repeated, her voice low and absolute. I will not be stolen again. She stepped toward him. She put her hand on the rifle he held and gently, firmly pushed the barrel toward the floor. She looked him in the eye, her gaze unwavering. This, she said, her other hand coming to rest on her belly, is our place now. Her words hung in the air, a declaration braver than any bullet. Ethan's panic cooled. She was right. Running meant they would always be running. Running meant the world was stronger than they were. Here on this land, he was the hunter. He was the soldier. He was not the prey. All right, he said, his voice quiet, his mind shifting from flight to fight. We stay, but we do it my way. The next 2 days were spent in grim, silent preparation. Ethan did not fortify the cabin. That was a death trap, a box with one door. Instead, he prepared the land. He took his spare rifle, the heavy Sharps 50 caliber, and a box of cartridges, and stashed them in a rocky crevice high up the ridge, a place that gave him a clear view of the cabin and the single trail leading to it. He spent an afternoon clearing brush, creating 2 clear firing lanes. He and Ayanna spoke little. The intimacy of the past weeks was replaced by a taut military focus. He showed her how to reload the Colt, his hands guiding hers until the movements were sure. If they come, he said, his voice flat, you do not stay in the cabin. You take this pistol, you run for the high rocks, for the place I showed you. You hide. You do not come out no matter what you hear. Do you understand? She nodded, her eyes dark. You will fight them. I will stop them, he said. We will stop them, she corrected, and her hand went unconsciously to her stomach. On the 3rd morning, the sun rose hot and blinding. The homestead was down to its last canteen of water. The creek was 100 yards down the canyon, a necessary, dangerous trip. I have to go, Ethan said. We're out of water. I'll be quick. I will come, Ayanna said. No, you stay, you watch. He handed her the field glasses he had carried since the war. Watch the trail. One rifle shot if you see them. One, then you run. Don't wait for me. He hated leaving her. Every instinct screamed against it. But thirst was an enemy that would kill them just as surely as Crane. He grabbed the two largest wooden buckets and headed down the trail toward the creek, the Winchester in his other hand. He moved quickly, his eyes scanning his ears, straining. Ayanna stood on the porch, the rifle heavy in her hands. She watched him disappear into the pinons. The silence of the valley was absolute, broken only by the buzz of a fly. She was using the field glasses, scanning the ridge when she saw them. Not on the main trail, but coming over the northern ridge. The hard way. The way they would not be expected. 4 riders, one in a black coat, Wade Brennan, his face still scarred, Rusty Dalton, and a 4th man, the drifter from the store. Her heart did not hammer. It went cold and still, 1 rifle shot. She raised the rifle, aimed at the sky, and fired. The sound cracked across the valley, echoing off the stone walls. Then she did as Ethan had said. She dropped the rifle, grabbed the Colt he had left for her, and ran. She did not run for the cabin. She ran for the trees, her hand protecting her belly as she moved. But she was not fast enough. They had heard the shot. They spurred their horses, crashing through the brush, and they saw her. There she is! Wade roared, his voice thick with hate. Grab the squaw! Ayanna ran barefoot, her feet slipping on the pine needles. The drifter cut her off, his horse rearing as he blocked her path. She spun, but Wade was on her. He launched himself from the saddle, tackling her. His heavy body drove the air from her lungs. She was plunged back into the nightmare. The smell of unwashed wool, of whiskey, the bruising grip, the coldness. She screamed a raw animal sound and fought her nails, raking for his eyes. Hold still, you heathen bitch, Wade snarled, trying to pin her wrists. Reverend Crane reined in his horse, his face a mask of pale fury. Brother Brennan, do not harm her. She is a ward of the church. Bind her. She needs to be taught a lesson first, preacher. Wade grunted, his face close to hers. He was enjoying this. Rusty Dalton had a rope. Just get her tied. We'll take her back to town and let the law handle Cole. Wade shifted his weight, fumbling for her hands. His grip loosened on one of her arms for just a second. In the kitchen, she had been slicing dried apples with her small carving knife. She had tucked it into the waistband of her skirt when she ran. Her hand, free for a second, found the handle. She did not think. She reacted. She pulled the knife and slashed upward, all her strength and terror behind it. Wade screamed. It was a high, thin sound. He recoiled, clutching his face. Blood poured through his fingers. The knife had laid his cheek open from the corner of his mouth to his ear, a gaping red smile. In that moment of shock, Ayanna scrambled free. She was on her feet and gone a deer, vanishing into the thick scrub oak. Get her! Crane shrieked, his composure shattering. Don't let her escape! Rusty and the drifter charged after her, but the terrain was too thick for horses. They dismounted and plunged into the brush. Wade was on the ground, howling and cursing, his blood staining the dry earth. Ethan heard the shot. His blood turned to ice. He dropped the half-filled buckets and scrambled up the canyon wall, grabbing at roots and rocks, his lungs burning. One shot. Run. She had run. He prayed she had run. He burst onto the flat, his rifle ready. He saw the horses. He saw Wade on the ground in a pool of blood. He saw Crane, his face a mask of rage. Cole! Crane shouted, pointing a pistol at him with a shaking hand. You will pay for this. She has mutilated my man. Where is she? Ethan roared, his voice inhuman. Gone, Crane yelled. Into the rocks. Rusty, find her. A shout came from the trees. We got her, preacher. She's trapped. Ethan did not wait. He ran past Crane, past the bleeding Wade, and followed the sounds. He moved with a speed and silence the others did not possess. He was a ghost in the trees, his buckskin shirt blending with the timber. He knew this land. He knew where she would go. There was a series of ledges, a place they had watched hawks from, with a sheer drop to the canyon floor below. It was a dead end. He heard them crashing through the brush ahead of him. He cut left, moving silently over the rockfall coming in above them. He found them. Ayanna was on a ledge 10 feet above them, her back to a sheer drop of 200 feet. The carving knife was still in her hand, her knuckles white. She was breathing hard, her eyes darting like a trapped animal. But she was not crying. Wade Brennan stood below her, his scarred face twisted with rage. The drifter was trying to climb up to her from the left. Rusty Dalton was on the right, covering with his pistol. "Come down, girl," Wade snarled, his voice thick with hate. "You cut me once. Now I'm gonna return the favor. Gonna cut that half-breed bastard right out of your belly." Ethan's blood turned to ice. He raised the Winchester. He did not call out. He did not warn them. The first shot took the drifter in the shoulder, spinning him off the rock face. He fell with a scream, tumbling into the brush below. Rusty turned his pistol, swinging toward Ethan. Cole, Ethan's second shot, hit Rusty in the leg, dropping him. Not a kill shot. Deliberate. Wade spun around his pistol, clearing his holster. His eyes met Ethan's. And in that moment, Ethan saw everything. The hate, the cruelty, the way Wade looked up at Ayanna with a predator's hunger. Wade fired first. The bullet whined past Ethan's ear. Ethan's third shot was calm, deliberate, final. The .44 caliber slug hit Wade Brennan square in the chest. The man's eyes went wide. He looked down at the blood spreading across his shirt, then back up at Ethan. You killed me," Wade gasped, his voice disbelieving. "Yes," Ethan said, "I did." Wade fell backward, his body tumbling down the rocky slope, coming to rest at the base of the cliff in a broken heap. Silence. The echo of the shots rolled down the canyon. Ayanna stared, her hand over her mouth. "Ayanna," Ethan said, stepping out from the trees. Below them on the trail, Reverend Crane appeared. His face was white. He looked at Wade's body and at Rusty writhing on the ground, clutching his leg, at the drifter moaning in the brush. "Murderer!" he shrieked. "You killed him. You shot an unarmed man." "He fired first," Ethan said coldly. "You saw it." "I saw nothing," Crane screamed. "I saw you murder a Christian man in cold blood. You will hang for this, Cole." Ayanna stared, her hand over her mouth. "Ayanna," Ethan said, stepping out from the trees. Below them on the trail, Crane appeared. His face was white. He looked at the two bodies, then up at Ethan. "Murderer!" he shrieked. "You are a godless killer." He had to Ethan walk down the game trail until he was on the same level as the preacher. He did not lower the rifle. His face was a terrible thing. All emotion burned away, leaving only a cold, deadly calm. "They tried to take her," he said. "She is my ward." Crane was trembling, but his righteous fury held him together. "The law is on my side. You will hang for this, Cole, you and your heathen whore." Ethan's rifle came up. The muzzle aimed not at Crane's chest, but at his face. "You lay hands on her again," Ethan said, his voice a low, grating whisper, "and I will plant you in this dirt. Do you understand me?" Crane flinched. He saw the truth in Ethan's eyes. This was not a threat. It was a statement of fact. "You can't," Crane stammered. "You can't kill a man of God." "I can," Ethan said. Hoofbeats pounded on the trail. "Hold your fire, Cole, in the name of the law." Sheriff Tom Garrett appeared, his horse sliding to a stop. He had two deputies with him. They had been on patrol, heard the shots, and come running. Garrett took in the scene in a single sweeping glance. Wade Brennan's body at the base of the cliff. Rusty Dalton bleeding on the ground. The drifter wounded in the brush. Crane pale and shaking. And Ethan, his rifle steady, his eyes locked on the preacher. "Jesus, Cole," Garrett breathed. "What happened here?" "He murdered Wade Brennan," Crane shrieked before Ethan could speak. "Shot him down, I saw it. There were witnesses. Wade fired first." Ethan said, his voice flat. "He was going after her." He pointed to Ayanna on the ledge, threatened to cut the baby out of her. Garrett's face hardened. He looked at Rusty. "That true, Dalton?" Rusty, clutching his bleeding leg, said nothing. "Doesn't matter what he said," Crane hissed. "Cole killed him. That's murder. The Brennan family has money, Sheriff. They have lawyers. They will see this man hang." Garrett looked at Ethan. His face was grim. "Cole, I believe you. But Crane's right about one thing. Wade's father is rich. He's got pull in Santa Fe. You just killed his son. Even if it was self-defense, there's going to be questions. There's going to be a trial." "Then there'll be a trial," Ethan said. "Until then," Garrett said heavily, "I can't just let you walk free. Not with a dead Brennan. You'll need to come with me. Post bail. Let the circuit judge sort it out." Ethan's jaw clenched. How long? Trials in 6 weeks, September. Garrett's voice was apologetic. I'm sorry, son, but you're a wanted man now. Until that trial, you're under the law's eye. Cole put the rifle down. Now, Garrett commanded. Ethan did not move. He came for her, Tom, with these men, to take her. He has papers, son. I told you, this is legal. Sheriff, Crane cried, finding his courage now that the law was here. Thank God this man is a killer. He murdered them. He shot them down without warning. I came to retrieve my legal ward and he massacred us. Garrett was torn. He looked at Ethan, then at the bodies. It was a bad business. He is no holy man. The voice came from above. Ayanna had climbed down from the ledge. She was barefoot. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. Her hair was wild and blood from Wade's face was smeared on her arm. She was trembling from head to toe, but her spine was straight. Crane's face went white. He had not expected her to speak. She walked until she stood beside Ethan, facing the sheriff. She did not look at Crane. She looked at Garrett, and when she spoke, the broken, halting English was gone. In its place was a clear, precise mission, educated voice that rang with cold authority. Reverend Crane is a liar, Sheriff, she said. Garrett's jaw dropped. The deputy stared. He did not find me, Ayanna continued, her voice gaining strength. He bought me. He paid $20 silver to a group of soldiers who had captured me. He told me it was the price for my soul. He kept me chained to his wagon for a month. He said it was God's will that I be broken. Lies, Crane sputtered. Slander, she is a heathen. She is corrupted by this man. He is no holy man, Ayanna said, her voice cutting through his protests. He is a slaver. He told me I was his property. Those men, she pointed at the bodies, came to steal me. That one, she pointed at Wade, who was now in the custody of a deputy, put his hands on me. I cut him. They cornered me. They were going to take me. Ethan saved me. She finally looked at Crane. Her eyes were filled with a loathing so pure it was almost visible. I am not your ward. I am a free woman, and I am this man's wife. The canyon was silent. Garrett looked at Crane, his face hardening. The preacher's righteous story had just been torn to shreds, not by a savage, but by an articulate, composed witness. The deputies who had been looking at Ethan as a killer now looked at Crane with open disgust. Wife, Garrett asked, looking at Ethan. Ethan had not lowered the rifle. That's what I said. She's mine. My wife. Garrett nodded slowly, a grim understanding dawning. He turned to Crane. Reverend, it seems your papers are based on a lie. You're under arrest for kidnapping, slave trading, and for inciting this. He gestured to the dead men. You brought these men here to commit a crime. Their deaths are on your head. This is an outrage, Crane shrieked. I am a man of the cloth. You will answer to the church. You will answer to God. Maybe, Garrett said, pulling his handcuffs. But first you'll answer to the circuit judge. As the deputies dragged the screaming preacher away, Garrett looked at Ethan. He motioned to the bodies. This is a hell of a mess, Cole. You made enemies today. Brennan's family has money. This town won't forget. Let them remember, Ethan said, just so long as they remember to stay away. Garrett nodded. He mounted his horse. You bury these men. Bury them deep. Garrett turned back to Ethan before mounting. Cole, there'll be a trial. Probably November. Wade's family will push for murder charges. You'll need to post bail. $500. Ethan's jaw tightened. That was nearly everything he had. You can stay here until then, Garrett continued. House arrest. But you show up for that trial, you hear me? You run, and I'll hunt you down myself. I'll be there, Ethan said. Garrett looked at Ayanna, still standing with her hand on her belly. His face softened. Take care of her, Cole, and that baby. He rode off, leaving them in the sudden ringing silence of the canyon. Ethan turned to Ayanna. The trembling had taken over her body, violent shudders. The terror she had held back now consumed her. He dropped the rifle and gathered her into his arms, lifting her, as he had the day he found her. He carried her back to the cabin. The door was splintered where they had tried to force it. The table was overturned. The small slate she had been writing on was shattered on the floor. He did not put her down. He sat in his chair, the one she had sat in when she was sick, and held her, cradling her as she wept. She cried silently, her body shaking and her face pressed into his neck. He said nothing. He just held her, his hand stroking her hair his own body aching with the aftermath of the fight. He held her for a long time until the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows into the cabin. Her shaking finally subsided. He pulled back, holding her face in his hands. Her eyes were swollen. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears. He gently wiped the bloodstain from her arm. "It's over," he whispered, his voice raw. "No more running, ever. You're safe. I swear it. You're safe." He kissed her forehead, her cheek, her tear-soaked eyelids. He kissed her mouth, a desperate, affirming kiss that was not about passion, but about life, a promise. "This land," he said, looking around the broken room, "it's not just my land. This is yours, Ayana. This is our place. No one will ever take you from it again." She nodded, her breath hitching. She was exhausted, her body drained, her mind bruised. The summer passed into autumn. Kaya was born in late October during the storm, a fierce entry into a world that was already at war. 2 weeks later, the trials of both Reverend Crane and Ethan Cole were held in Santa Fe in early November. Ethan had spent the months since the shooting under house arrest at the homestead. Sheriff Garrett had been merciful, allowing him to post bail of $500 rather than holding him in jail. It was nearly every dollar Ethan had saved, but it meant he could stay with Ayana through the pregnancy and birth. But the shadow of the trial hung over every moment of joy. When November came, they rode together to Santa Fe. Ayana, with 2-week-old Kaya wrapped against her chest in a cradle board, sat in the courtroom gallery. Her presence and the baby's soft breathing was a quiet defiance. The trial lasted 3 days. Ayana testified, her English flawless, her testimony damning. The judge, embarrassed by the fraud committed under his seal, sentenced Crane to 10 years of hard labor for kidnapping and fraud. Then it was Ethan's turn. The prosecutor, hired by the Brennan family, was a sharp-featured man from Denver. He painted Ethan as a vigilante who had taken the law into his own hands. "Mr. Cole shot Wade Brennan in the chest," the lawyer said, pacing before the jury. "Not in the leg to stop him, not in the arm to disarm him, in the chest to kill. That is not self-defense, gentlemen of the jury. That is murder." Ayana testified for Ethan. She stood before the court, her back straight, 2-week-old Kaya strapped to her chest in the cradle board. She told them about the ambush, about Wade's threat. "I'm going to cut that half-breed bastard right out of your belly." She did not cry. She did not plead. She simply told the truth in clear, unwavering English. Rusty Dalton, his leg still bandaged, was called to testify. Under oath, he admitted that Wade had fired first. He admitted they had come to take Ayana by force against her will. Ethan testified last. He stood before the court, his hands scarred, his face weathered. He did not apologize. "Wade Brennan fired at me," he said, his voice steady. "He threatened my wife and my unborn child. I stopped him. I am not sorry. I would do it again." The jury deliberated for 6 hours. The verdict, justifiable homicide. But the judge's words carried a warning. "Mr. Cole, you took a man's life. This court finds you acted in lawful defense of your family. You are free to go, but let this be known, vigilante justice will not be tolerated. You are a marked man. The Brennan family will not forget. Walk carefully." Ethan stood. He looked at the judge, then at the Brennan family sitting in the gallery, their faces twisted with hate and grief. "Let them remember," he said quietly, "just so long as they remember to stay away." The summer passed into autumn. Colonel James Hartford, the owner of the largest ranch in the territory, came to the homestead in early September. He was a tall man in his 60s, a former Confederate officer who understood honor even if he did not always practice it. "I came to apologize, Cole," he said, standing on the porch, hat in hands. "I believed Crane. I was wrong. What you did standing up for her like that took courage. More courage than most men have." Ethan nodded. "She's worth it." Hartford looked at Ayana, who was sitting on the porch, her belly now huge, her hands resting on it. "I can see that. If you need anything, you let me know. A man who fights for his family deserves respect." The words spread through the territory. Ethan Cole was no longer just the hermit on the ridge. He was the man who had faced down the law and won. He was the man who had killed a man to protect his wife. People left them alone after that. October brought the first hard frosts. The aspens turned gold, a fire of color against the dark evergreens. Ayana was huge now, moving slowly, her time near. On a cold night in late October, the storm broke. It was not a gentle rain. It was a return to the violence of the land, a furious high country thunderstorm that brought wind, then sleet, then snow. The wind shrieked, slamming against the new walls of the cabin. Thunder cracked, echoing off the canyon walls. Ayanna woke him, her hand gripping his. "Ethan, it is time." The words he had been waiting for and dreading. He flew into action, building the fire up until it roared, heating water, his mind racing. He was a soldier. He was a builder. He was not a midwife. His only experience with birth was the one that had stolen Sarah. The memory sent a spike of pure cold panic through his heart. The labor was long. The storm outside matched the one inside. For hours, Ayanna paced her face, a mask of concentration, breathing through the pain. As the night wore on, the pain grew, and she moved to the bed he had built, her hands gripping the wooden frame until her knuckles were white. Ethan could do nothing but watch. He wiped her face with a cool cloth. He gave her water. He spoke soothing words that felt hollow and useless. As the hours stretched on, he began to panic. "It's been too long," he said, his voice tight, his pacing frantic. "This is how it was before. Ayanna, it's not right. It's too hard." He was panicking. He was seeing Sarah's pale, exhausted face. He was failing again. Ayanna, in the deep, agonizing grip of a contraction, opened her eyes and looked at him. She saw his fear. She saw his ghost. And in the center of her own pain, she found the strength to save him. She reached out her hand, weak but her grip iron. "Ethan, stop." He froze. "Look at me," she commanded, her voice a raw gasp. He knelt by the bed. "Listen." He could hear the wind howling like a wolf, the crack of the thunder. "We both made from storms," she breathed, her eyes locking with his. "Born in them. This is how she will come. Do not be afraid. Be strong. Be the work." His own words thrown back at him. It was as if she had struck him, his panic shattered. She was right. This was not a memory. This was now. This was his wife. This was his child. He was not a helpless spectator. He was her husband. "I'm here," he said, his voice steady again. He took her hand. "I'm with you. I'm not afraid." The final hours were a blur of pain and prayer and effort. He held her. He supported her. He whispered the Apache lullabies he had learned, his rough voice a counterpoint to her cries in the storm's roar. Just as the false dawn was lighting the sky, the storm reached its peak. A bolt of lightning struck the ridge above the cabin. The crack was simultaneous with the flash. In that moment of electric silence, Ayanna gave a final desperate cry, and it was answered by another. A thin, reedy, furious wail. It cut through the sound of the thunder, through the howling wind. It was the sound of life. Ethan's hands shook so hard he could barely hold the knife. He did what he had to do. His vision blurred. He cleaned the baby, his rough hands clumsy, his heart exploding. A girl. A small, perfect, healthy girl. She had a full head of dark, dark hair, matted and wet. He wrapped her in the new flannel and laid her on Ayanna's chest. Ayanna was exhausted, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. But she smiled. She touched the baby's face. Ethan sank to the floor, his back against the wall. And he wept. He cried for Emma, for the child he had lost. He cried for the men he had killed. And he cried for the impossible, perfect joy of the small, wailing life that had just entered his home. As the storm passed and the first true light of morning, clean and cold, filled the new room, the baby opened her eyes. They were not dark like her mother's. They were a pale, clear gray like the sky after a storm, like his. But on her left cheek, just below her eye, there was a small, faint birthmark. A crescent moon, a sacred mark of the Apache. There was a knock at the door. Ethan, still on the floor, looked up in alarm. He grabbed the Colt. The door opened slowly. Dakota stood there, snow dusting his shoulders, his weathered face calm. "I heard the thunder," the old man said in Apache, then switched to English for Ethan. "I knew the child would come." He walked to the bed. He looked down at the baby in Ayanna's arms. He saw the gray eyes. He saw the crescent birthmark. He spoke in Apache to Ayanna. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. Dakota turned to Ethan. "She is blessed. The spirits of both worlds claim her. She is what we call a bridge child. She will walk between your people and ours." Ayanna whispered, her voice hoarse. "Kaya. Her name is Kaya. It means willow tree. Bends, but does not break." "Kaya Cole," Ethan said, tasting the name. "Yes." Dakota stayed through the morning, helping with the things Ethan did not know how to do. He showed Ethan how to wrap the baby, how to help Ayanna. The old skills of his people passed to this white man who had killed his friend, but now protected that friend's daughter. By noon, Dakota was gone, walking back into the forest as silently as he had come. 6 months later, on a warm spring afternoon, they sat beneath the great cottonwood tree by the creek. The air was warm. The leaves were that new bright green that spoke of life renewed. Ethan leaned against the trunk. Ayanna rested between his knees, her back against his chest. Kaya was asleep in her mother's arms, her small face peaceful. It was a moment of complete, unblemished peace. They sat in silence for a long time, just listening to the creek and the wind. Ayanna looked down at the sleeping child. She studied the impossible fusion of their two worlds, the dark, fine hair of her own people, the pale, clear eyes of his. She touched the baby's soft cheek, the crescent birthmark visible when the light hit it just right. She tilted her head back to look up at Ethan, a small, curious smile playing on her lips. "So," she whispered, her mind reaching back to the girl who had known nothing of tenderness, who had asked her questions in broken English. "This is how white people make children." She paused, her gaze thoughtful. "I think I understand now." Ethan smiled. The scars on his face, the lines of grief and violence softened. He leaned down his beard, brushing her hair, and kissed the top of her head. He looked from his wife to his child. "No," he replied, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "We made her together." And in that small, sacred moment beneath the cottonwood, with the creek singing its endless song and the wind whispering through new leaves, they understood something profound. Love was not a word, it was not a feeling that came and went like the seasons. Love was the work, the building, the fighting, the choosing, the staying. Love was the room he had built with his own hands. Love was the lullabies he had learned in a language not his own. Love was the scars on his knuckles from defending her. Love was the shell necklace on Sarah's grave, a blessing from one woman to another across the divide of death. Love was the child sleeping between them, born of storms but cradled in peace. Born of violence but raised in safety. Born of two worlds but belonging to both. Love was their place, this high valley where the wind sang and the aspens turned gold each fall and the creek ran cold and clear, and they would never leave it again. In the years to come, Kaya would grow strong and wise. She would learn her father's trade and her mother's songs. She would speak both English and Apache with equal fluency. She would become, as Dakota had prophesied, a bridge between two peoples who had warred for generations. But that is a story for another time. For now, in this perfect spring afternoon, a family rested beneath a cottonwood tree. A man who had learned that the heart could survive the worst losses and still find joy. A woman who had learned that not all men were predators, that some could be protectors, partners home. And a child who carried the legacy of both their strengths, both their peoples, both their hopes. The high desert wind blew soft and warm. The creek sang, the aspens whispered their ancient songs, and in a small cabin on a remote ridge in New Mexico territory, love had won. Not easily, not without cost, but completely, utterly, and forever.